everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode. Today, we're going to get straight into it, like really quickly. We're going to talk about something pretty major going on in, well, global trade, basically.
Yeah.
It's about the latest actions between the U.S. and China under President Trump.
Yep.
You shared some really sharp analyses focusing on these new tariffs that have been going back and forth, these export controls, and really just try to understand what it means looking ahead.
Yep.
And so I guess our mission today is to really take a look at these insights, like specifically, what do they tell us about the global economy and where technology is going?
Totally. And I think the material that you provided gives us a really good overview of immediate responses, like the nitty-gritty of the new policies.
Yeah.
Like we have announcements of new tariffs, we have restrictions from both sides,
Right.
and like analysis, right, of how different industries are going to feel the impact. And I think, as we kind of jump into this, it's a dynamic situation.
Yeah.
Lots to unpack.
Okay, so let's start with these tariffs.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the kind of the big headline grabber here, right? Like, it sounds like President Trump has kind of upped the ante here.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So the reports detail a new 34% tariff on Chinese goods.
Okay.
And the important thing to understand here is this is not like a first strike. This is on top of a previous 20% tariff.
Yeah.
So, you're looking at some products facing a total of 54% in new duties.
Wow.
And this is, just to give you a time frame, around April 3rd or 4th of 2025 when this was announced.
So really recent.
Yeah, very recent.
Okay, so I mean, it's probably no surprise, like, that China didn't just kind of, take that lying down.
Yeah.
What was their immediate counter?
Yeah, so, as expected, China immediately announced a reciprocal 34% tariff on all goods coming from the U.S. This is going into effect, in about a week, on April 10th, 2025.
Yeah.
And so, if you think about it, it's a very direct response. It's proportional.
Yeah.
Right. So, like for like.
Now, this isn't the first time, right, that we've seen China respond to U.S. tariffs with tariffs of their own. I vaguely remember something about coal and natural gas.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in earlier rounds, China had already placed 15% tariffs on imports of U.S. coal and liquefied natural gas.
Okay.
So it's kind of this back and forth.
Oh, right.
Right. And so this just, signals really a major escalation
Yeah.
in the trade tensions.
Okay, so let's shift gears just a little bit here.
Yeah.
It looks like export controls are becoming a much bigger part of this picture, and so I kind of want to start with China's actions on rare earth minerals. And I think for those of you who follow the tech world, this sounds pretty crucial, right?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting here is we see that China's move here is very deliberate. It's very strategic.
Yeah.
And they've announced export controls on a very specific set of medium and heavy rare earth minerals.
Okay.
Right. These are, if you want to write them down, these are samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium.
Got it.
Okay, so a lot of big words. But I think the point here is that these are absolutely vital
Okay.
in a range of different technologies.
Okay.
Right. And so we're talking, things like the magnets used in defense systems,
Okay.
aerospace, even the core of MRI scanning technology.
Wow.
Right. Or even, various components in aerospace manufacturing, the defense sector. So you can see how, these are not just, random elements.
Right.
These are actually kind of linchpins in entire technological ecosystems.
Okay.
And so China's control isn't just market share here.
Yeah.
It's about, potential choke points.
Yeah.
And, global innovation and global security.
So these are the kinds of materials that are fundamental to a lot of kind of the industries of the future, right?
That's
These
correct.
cutting edge industries. And it sounds like China has a really dominant position in this whole rare earth market, right?
They do, and I think that's a really important point to understand. China holds a very significant amount of control over both the mining and the refining of these rare earth elements.
Okay.
And so, estimates suggest that they're responsible for about 69% of the global rare earth mining and a staggering 90% of refining processes.
Wow.
Right. So that gives them a considerable amount of leverage in the global supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, so restricting exports of these specific minerals could really, really create some, I imagine major headaches, right? For U.S. industries that are trying to make these advanced products.
Right.
Now the U.S. has also been using export controls. What actions have they taken recently?
Yeah. So the U.S. They've responded in kind by adding 16 U.S. entities to its own export control list. And so this essentially means that the export of what are called dual-use items.
Dual-use items, okay.
Yeah, so think of advanced microprocessors that can be used in your phone, but also maybe missile guidance systems.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so these are things that can be used in civilian applications, but also military.
Yeah.
So export to these listed firms is now prohibited.
Okay.
Right. We know High Point Aero Technologies. We know Universal Logistics Holding. These are some of the companies on that list. But separately, the U.S. has also added 11 U.S. firms to something called the Unreliable Entities List.
Unreliable Entities
Yeah,
List.
and this is a little bit more serious.
Okay.
Because it allows Beijing to take punitive actions against those firms.
Okay.
Right. Potentially including banning new investments, even restricting their import and export activities within China.
Wow.
So, this is getting serious.
Yeah. So do we know which U.S. firms are kind of on that unreliable entities list, the ones that are facing those tougher penalties?
We do. The report's named Skydio Inc. and Brent's Drones.
Okay.
And they're on that list for arms sales to Taiwan.
I see.
Which, as you know, is a sensitive point for China, right?
Right.
So, clearly, you're seeing how these actions are all tied to that geopolitical dynamic.
Yeah, and it seems like the trade tensions are kind of rippling into other sectors as well. I saw something about agricultural imports being suspended by China.
Yeah, that's right. So this is another layer to China's response. They've announced an immediate suspension of sorghum imports from C&D USA Incorporated. Okay. And then in addition to that, they suspended poultry and bone meal from 3 other U.S. companies.
Okay.
Right. Now, the official reasons they give are, the detection of furazolidone, a drug that's banned in China.
Okay.
And then high levels of mold in the sorghum and salmonella in the bone meal.
So, I mean, it's a pretty, broad set of actions from China, right? We're talking tariffs, these critical minerals that we talked about, specific companies being targeted, agricultural trade. I mean, this sounds like it's having a huge impact already.
It is.
Let's talk about some of the wider economic and geopolitical consequences. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing effects in the stock market.
Absolutely, yeah. So the news reports highlighted a sharp drop in U.S. stock futures on Friday.
Okay.
Following these announcements. So what does this mean? This means that, basically people are expecting further losses on Wall Street.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, figures suggest that, like $2.4 trillion was wiped off of U.S. equities as a consequence of these escalating trade tensions.
2.4 trillion.
Yeah. I mean, that's not just like an abstract number.
Yeah. Wow.
It actually represents like a loss of confidence from investors. And it really signals that people are uneasy.
Right.
About global trade.
Right.
And that ultimately impacts everyone.
Yeah.
From pension funds to your individual savings.
Okay, now China has also taken a more formal route, right? To challenge these U.S. tariffs on the international stage.
They have, yeah. So demonstrating a very multi-pronged approach. China has filed a formal complaint against the new U.S. tariffs with the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Okay.
Right. And they argue that these measures violate WTO rules.
Okay.
And so they've requested consultations as part of a dispute settlement process.
Okay.
And so this shows, China's continued commitment, maybe even strained, to this, international trade framework.
Okay. So what are analysts saying about the potential for all of this to kind of spiral, right?
Yeah.
Into a full-blown trade war? I mean, it feels like we're heading in that direction.
Yeah. So I think there's a growing worry, and analysts are saying this as well, about trade war escalation.
Okay.
And the reason is China's response this time feels notably less restrained compared to previous rounds.
Okay.
And so that means that there's a shift in China's strategy.
Okay.
And it suggests that the hope for a near-term trade deal is fading.
Yeah.
Right. So One comment I saw was that China's previous responses were like using a scalpel,
Oh, right.
whereas this time they've kind of drawn a sword.
Right.
So it's a little bit more
A
confrontational.
little bit more aggressive, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting to think about like how previous U.S.-China trade tensions have kind of had knock-on effects around the world, and I remember reading something about how South Asian economies actually benefited. Is that something that we might see again, and what could that mean for kind of the bigger global picture?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point to consider. So the idea here is that you're right. Previous periods of U.S.-China trade friction did lead to some growth in South Asian countries.
Okay.
Right. India, Bangladesh, the idea is they become alternative trading hubs
Yeah.
as companies look to diversify.
Right.
Right. And so the question now is, will this trend continue?
Yeah.
Right. With this new escalation, it definitely has the potential to reshape, regional and global power politics.
Right.
Right. It could give some of these economies more influence. But the other side of the coin is that, these same economies could find themselves caught in the middle.
Right.
Right. Facing pressure to kind of side with one or the other.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting illustration of how interconnected, the world is.
Right.
That, one nation's trade dispute can actually create opportunities for others.
Right.
So it's kind of this, ripple effect
Yeah.
in a global pond.
Yeah, and it seems like, the technology sector in particular is pretty vulnerable in all of this, especially with these export controls targeting, semiconductors, AI. I mean, what are the potential consequences for U.S. technology leadership?
Right. Yeah. So this is something to be concerned about. And I think there's a worry that the U.S. export controls that are aimed at, China's semiconductor and AI sector, right, that are intended to slow them down, actually might hurt the U.S.
Okay.
in the long run.
I see.
And so we're talking decoupling
Right.
of these vital industries,
Yeah.
right? And so what's interesting is that it appears as though the U.S. sanctions are actually inadvertently driving Chinese tool makers to become more competitive, to become more innovative,
I see.
right? Because they're trying to, replace these restricted technologies.
Yeah.
And so then you also have U.S. tech companies that have to replace the revenue that they lose
Right.
from the Chinese market.
Right.
So it's complex, right? There are unintended consequences
Right.
on both sides.
Right.
And this will ultimately shape the landscape of technological innovation
Right.
in the years to come.
And Trump, he's always been very outspoken about these policies, often taking to social media.
Right.
What's been his reaction to these latest countermeasures from China?
Yeah. So as you would expect, President Trump has taken to his platform.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And he posted in all caps that, quote, China played it wrong. They panicked the one thing they cannot afford to do, end quote.
Wow.
Right. He also commented on their reciprocal tariffs and even hinted at, potential TikTok negotiations.
Oh, wow.
Right. Even though, the recent trade tensions make that unlikely.
Yeah, yeah.
But that just shows, kind of the state of play,
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a step back, right? And look at kind of the bigger picture here. What were the main kind of driving forces behind President Trump's, initial move to use tariffs in the first place?
Yeah, so I think to understand where we are today, you kind of have to, remember how it all started.
Yeah.
And so President Trump had previously imposed 10% tariffs on Chinese goods back in February and March 2025.
Okay.
Right. And at that time, he cited the fentanyl crisis.
Okay.
Right. But the broader U.S. objectives, they seem to be more strategic.
Okay.
Right. And I think that these are things like, reducing dependence on China.
Yeah.
Right. Strengthening domestic economic and military power.
Okay.
Right. And fundamentally, trying to check China's economic and technological rise.
Right.
Right. And so, if you look at it, they're targeting things like semiconductors. They're targeting things like electric vehicles. So very strategic.
Okay. So, and how has China been, strategically responding to these wider pressures? I mean, beyond just, hitting back with tariffs, what are some of the other things that they've been doing?
Yeah. So China's response has been quite comprehensive.
Okay.
Right. They've been trying to boost domestic consumption.
Okay.
Right. So they don't have to rely on exports so much.
Okay.
There's been a significant increase in government funding for research and development, specifically in areas like semiconductors,
Okay.
right? They've also been trying to strengthen their trade relationships with other countries in the region.
Yeah.
So you're talking things like, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI,
Yeah.
all these things designed to create alternative markets.
Yeah.
So they don't have to rely on the U.S.
So it's a pretty intricate web of tariffs, export controls, and kind of these broader strategic maneuvers from both sides. I mean, huge consequences, right, for the global economy and the future of tech.
Yeah, exactly. It's very fluid, this situation, and I think, the long-term outcomes are still uncertain.
Okay, so let's start to wrap this up.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways? Like, what do you really want people to remember from our discussion today?
So I think, the main takeaway is that the relationship between the U.S. and China in terms of trade, it's gotten more intense
Yeah.
and more complex.
Right.
It's not just about tariffs,
Yeah.
right? You're talking export controls, you're talking targeted actions against companies,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing this have an effect on the stock market.
Yeah.
Right. And ultimately, this is going to reshape the dynamics of global trade.
Right.
And the implications for technology, the geopolitical landscape,
Yeah.
are very real.
Yeah, and I guess for me, was there a detail that you found like particularly surprising, or interesting, through all this?
Yeah, I mean, what really stood out to me was I guess the speed at which Chinese tech companies in particular are adapting
Okay.
to the U.S. export controls.
Yeah.
And the fact that, these companies, they were kind of, second-tier suppliers, right? They're becoming more competitive with U.S. players, and that really highlights the unintended consequences.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's a really, really dynamic and resilient response
Okay.
from the Chinese tech sector.
Okay. Well, this has been a really concentrated look, I think, at a pretty complex and fast-moving situation. Hopefully, it's given everyone a clear understanding of kind of the most important aspects of these actions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a multifaceted issue.
Right.
There are no easy answers,
Right.
but understanding these dynamics is crucial.
And to leave you with a final thought, think about how deeply connected the global economy has become. How might these actions affect your daily life? I mean, the technology that you use, the goods that you consume, and then on a bigger scale, what long-term shifts in global power dynamics might we anticipate as this rivalry continues to unfold? So definitely something to consider. Thanks for listening.